Hello, good evening. I am Liz Mosley. Welcome to Thursday evening's Thinkin, Tortoise ThinkIn. Very warm welcome to those of you that haven't been to a digital Thinkin before, and of course welcome back to all the regulars and people's names that I can recognise in the participants list. It's a real pleasure to be here and a real pleasure to have with us David Lammy. And there he is. Hello, David. For Tottenham for 20 years, where we're going to have a conversation this evening about all manner of things, about his long career in politics, about the amazing book that came out, I think, in February this year called Tribes. We're going to talk about social justice, about Black Lives Matter, about the future of politics, loads and loads of stuff. So a lot to get through in an hour. As always, I would love for you to weigh in the chat or by putting your little blue digital hand up if you can find it in the participants tab. My colleague Ellie Jacobs is moderating the chat. Hello, Ellie. There she is, give a wave. And I'll get the ball rolling with David in a second, and then I'm sure that there'll be loads of questions and thoughts and ideas and things that you'll want to pitch in as we kind of trot round quite a big list of things I'd like to pick David's brains on and sort of hear his pearls of wisdom. He doesn't really need a major introduction, but of course he's not only been representing the people of Tottenham in Parliament for 20 years, he's now Keir Starmer's Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, Shadow Lord Chancellor, of course, a prominent campaigner for justice, particularly at the forefront of the fight for the Grenfell families and, of course, the Windrush British citizens. So there's a ton of things, David, that I would love your insights on, and I know you're probably exhausted, so thank you so much for sticking with us for this hour. If I can, I'm going to start with Tribes. Tribes is the book that you wrote that came out at the beginning of the year, sort of before the pandemic. It feels like another lifetime, but it was kind of before the virus came. And it's about the balance between an innate human feeling, which is a need to belong and to find yourself and people with whom you feel you are part of, and a sort of bigger need for humanity to come together, and sometimes that those things can fall into conflict, and how to make them work for the benefit of one another rather than against one another. And it's been described as a plea for empathy, as a sort of the thesis of how it flows. Because obviously you wrote it before coronavirus, and then more recently before George Floyd and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter and all of the protests that have happened in this country. I just wonder how you feel about it now. Now we're at this side of it all.
The book has got a memoir feel to it. So I write personally about a whole range of things that have happened to me, about my background, about the tribes that I belong to. I took a DNA test and went back to the African tribe that my mother's all the way back was from, in Niger. And I went back to Peterborough, where I spent 7 years at boarding school. And obviously I talk about Tottenham, my Caribbean background. And then I sort of open out, and I have two central chapters. One is on loneliness. One is on identity politics. And then I sort of wrap up with a prescription about what I think Britain needs, really, if we're to come together and move out of this phase of division and a sort of ramped up tribalism that you see all across society. In a sense, and I will update the book for the, you know, probably for the paperback next year, but I suppose where we are fits perfectly. The lockdown has, for some people, been tough, has been about loneliness, has been about dealing with mental health. For others, it's been a wake-up call to their life, somehow the slowing down, the being at home. For me, it's actually, London's been a bit like, certainly the early part of the lockdown, it was like the London I grew up in the 70s, where people there were fewer cars, less pollution, the shops didn't open on a Sunday.
Yeah.
And then obviously the theme of identity politics and what that means. And mine was really a defense of it, but also a sense that in the end, you can't begin a conversation with identity politics and end it with identity politics. We've got to come together. I guess the murder of George Floyd and this Black Lives Matter historic moment that we're experiencing kind of epitomizes really that. It epitomizes both difference across society, structural racism that's real. It's been interesting that Britain has been willing to have a debate about structural racism and institutional racism and not just sort of think of it as an American problem. But equally, we have to come together. And so what's been heartening even about the protests is that Black and white have taken to the streets, particularly millennials and Generation Y, who seem to have an articulacy about this subject that their parents and generations upwards have lacked here in the UK. And I guess the other theme of the book, where it ends up, is that ultimately to deal with the global challenges of climate change and the refugee crisis, but actually also the pandemic, things that require global solutions, we have first got to have the ingredients of neighborhood and the local, and we have to belong to something and feel connected to something that then gives governments permissions to act in a global way. And that has been problematic here in the UK. Not going to go back into Brexit, but you know, it's definitely been a problematic story here in the UK. And we've seen also that governments that you would historically have expected to lead the way globally, like our own, like the United States, have struggled to do that in relation to the pandemic.
Yeah. There's a ton of stuff I could pick up on from the things that you've just said, David. You've said before, I want to talk to you about Peterborough in a minute, but you said before that you think it is the job of politicians to encourage construction of new public spaces in which every Briton, whatever their skin colour, religion or background, can feel they belong, which I think is something that is easy for everybody to agree with. It's not only the job of politicians to do that thing. Some of the politicians, perhaps in this country and in other countries, it would seem that they're less focused on that as their job. I just wonder if you could sort of unpack a bit. It feels like there's an opportunity for change, and I think you're right to highlight the sort of younger generations are finding a way to unravel it, where our generation hasn't been as successful, which is exciting and interesting. But I wonder if you have a sense of...
I guess what I suppose I'm getting at, I'm getting at nation building.
Okay.
I'm harking back to an era of politicians that built great civic institutions and towns and cities across our country.
Yeah.
I'm getting at the sense of noblesse oblige, even if it's politically problematic. I mean, if you watch Downton Abbey, you'll see a sort of benevolence to the village, to the town, from the Lord of the Manor right through, and a kind of obligation. Now, obviously, I'm a Labour politician, there are problems in that, but I'm harking back to a sense of belonging, both locally, regionally and nationally, that turn out to be really, really important. And here in the UK, you know, we don't really attend the business of nation building like other countries do. I guess because we have old institutions like the monarchy, the Church of England. We have new national moments, or newish national moments, like the the Olympics or the World Cup. But actually, if you're in Germany, or if you're in Canada or Australia or Japan, or indeed the United States, this business of nation building is real and constant.
Yeah.
And so I'm sort of saying, what are our new institutions other than the BBC? Do we need some? How do we come back together again as a society? Where do we forge that? One of the things I come up with is a national civic service, as a way of a compulsory national civic service, by the way, where you're requiring a young person growing up in Sunderland to meet a young person growing up in Bognor Regis, to meet a young person growing up in Tottenham, for a civic purpose. Now, some countries do that in terms of a national service that's military. That's not my suggestion in the book, but it's just a starter for 10 on a way in which you bind society. Now, for many of your, for this audience who've been to university, they might not feel the need for that because you kind of meet other young people from different parts of the country. But the truth is, half the country don't go to university. They hardly get to leave their town or their city. So this business of the national story becomes really important, particularly if you agree with my thesis that we are pretty divided at the moment as a country, and Brexit tore us apart. There's a big north-south divide. There's a sort of rural, suburban, urban divide. Black Lives Matter highlights huge divides between the 3% of our population that's black, the rest of our minority ethnic population that gets us to 14%, and the rest of the country. And therefore, this business of how we encounter one another, I call it an encounter culture in the book, is really, really, really important. And you know, I'm a politician because I was a cathedral chorister, which is a great way to understand the nation, praising its name every day in a big cathedral. I got the ability to go to 2 great universities, one in the United States and SOAS in London. I was a lawyer, and in the end, I serve in terms of public service in a huge and important public institution. But how do we afford that sense of connection to everybody?
Yeah. I'm going to bring in, if I can, Alison Navarro, who's been making some, I think, interesting comments in the chat. Are you there, Alison? Alison Navarro.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Alison? Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, so interesting listening to the identity politics. So I'm from Liverpool. I'm from a prominent black family in Liverpool, where we have fought race equality all of our lives. And I moved to London 10 years ago. And one of the reasons for moving to London was because I wanted to be in a space where black people just lived and just were. And it's not like that in Liverpool. Liverpool's very, very divided. And I love that. I love that every street corner you turn down. I live in Streatham. Every street corner you go down, you know, there's just the diversity of people is there. And I work in Sutton, and I've done a lot of work in terms of equalities in the time that I've been there. But at the moment, I'm feeling that like I haven't got an authentic voice because I'm so light-skinned. And if I was in Liverpool, then that at the moment that would be kind of well, people would just know. People in Liverpool can see just by looking at me which family I belong to, and I find I'm having to explain myself all the time that I actually am a member of the black community, and I'm struggling with that. I'm feeling quite vulnerable, I think, where I've always been able to kind of, you know, I guess, you know, lead and support and facilitate voices. So yeah, the thing about identity politics, I think I need to look into in a bit more detail. But I think I feel a bit disenfranchised, I think is what I'm saying. And maybe it's of my own thinking, but that's how I feel.
So read that chapter in my book. Read Rennie Edo-Lodge's book and Afua Hirsch's book. They're 2 recent books, both of whom talk quite a lot about mixed heritage identity. And look, my kids are look like you. Got 3 of them. My wife doesn't look like me. She's a lot prettier than I am.
Don't do yourself down, David. You're lovely.
And she's posh. I hope she doesn't mind me saying that, but she is. And she's white. But actually, in the book, I talk about Englishness, and actually, you know, a few folk have challenged me on this. Subsequently, I want to demand that I'm allowed to say that I'm English, not just British. I mean, I think there's a lot of people of colour in this country who feel able to say they're British, perhaps because of the Commonwealth connection. But in the book, I explore what Peterborough gave me, and living in the States and getting a bit depressed and missing home, missing Walker's Crisps and Ribena and football and rugby and a grey, dreary sky, and wanting to claim my Englishness. And I guess I'm aware, because of the, I mean, you just have to look at my tweets and some of the sort of comments I get underneath my tweets, the challenge to my identity, people questioning my Englishness and my ability to be English. You know, people, you know, go back to where you come from, you're not English, sort of thing. And that's because there is in Britain a strand of folk, and I think it's, you know, it's been somehow emboldened over this last period, who think that being English is a sort of ethno-national identity, that basically you've got to be of, I don't know, Celtic, Norman, whatever, Viking stock. It's a bit ridiculous because, of course, that means you're mixed up anyway. But that's what your claim, your sort of Anglo-Saxon claim to Englishness is, and of course it's not that. And why I said you should read those books is because there are historic communities in Liverpool, historic communities in Cardiff, historic communities in Bristol that are of colour, that are multicultural and mixed in identity, that are about maritime history, that multicultural Commonwealth history, coming to those big port areas and thriving as community, but often impoverished communities, often communities experiencing racism, and this perennial question: where are you from? That people like me get, where are your parents from? Who are you? You know, this is a frequent request in here in this country, and I guess this moment, this historic moment, is about getting underneath that and challenging that and understanding why someone like you can be feeling a bit anxious and a bit out of sorts and a bit out of place, even though you're born and bred in this country and you've lived here, you know, all of your life, I guess, right? And you come from a part of the country, a great part of the country. I love, by the way, Liverpool. I love Merseyside, the Wirral, all of that area. It's an iconic part of the country that's generated tremendous culture, talent, but yet you're sitting there, who am I? Do I quite fit in? And that's what I mean about how do we bind and create a shared story.
So I think for me, it's not in London. If I was in Liverpool, I think I'd be absolutely fine, and I would know where my place was. And I think it's the context of London.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's a context in which people in London don't necessarily know that story that is common in Liverpool, Cardiff, or Bristol.
Thanks so much, Alison. Lovely to see you again. I'm going to come actually to, I want to bring in, I know my colleague Tanya, although she has pre-warned me that she doesn't look good, wants to come on and ask a political question, but I'm really taken with something Brad Hayward put in the chat further up, which is about sort of the nastiness of public discourse, if you like. Brad, are you there? Brad Hayward.
Yep, can you hear me?
Hi, sorry, it's like, I know it caught you off guard a little bit, but I was very taken with your remark about Ashton Hewitt. Can you just fill us in on what's been going on?
That's Muhammad Ali behind you, Brad.
It is, yes, it is.
I really want that. It's very rare that I see something that I covet and that I would sort of reach in and steal. And I
for the right price, I'm sure a deal could be struck.
Question.
Yeah, so I work within professional rugby, so I work for the Welsh Rugby Union. And one of our players within our squad, and a friend of mine, Ashton Hewitt, for those of you that haven't heard of the story really, he's been quite outspoken, and rightly so, about the BLM movement and trying to gain a bit of traction locally within South Wales. Cut a long story short, his campaign on social media eventually resulted in Katie Hopkins being removed from Twitter, which is down to some of the messaging she put out around himself. Post that, obviously, there's become a bit of a backlash for Ashton. Spoke to him again this afternoon, and I wouldn't say he's in a dark place, but he is getting a lot of abuse, a lot of video imagery sent to him, which is, wildly inappropriate, and a lot of hate. Suppose my thought is around how tribal I feel we're becoming, and how we're lacking the ability to clearly communicate with each other and just discuss our differences or different viewpoints, and why does it have to become so emotional and so tribal, really?
Brad, thank you for that question. Look, that's what the book's about. That's why I'm motivated to write it. And I was sent a horrific racist letter. I mean, I get them every day. My office have to wade through them. But on this occasion, the police are wonderful, by the way, and I'm really grateful to the Metropolitan Police and the staff at the House of Commons for having to deal with this stuff for me. But an individual was charged, and I decided on this occasion to go up to the court case. It was in Wolverhampton, and sort of look this guy in the face. And what I found was quite a pathetic, shuffling, kind of lonely individual, really, spewing out this hate. And I write about that in the book, and I write about the way in which social media particularly is ramping this up. Some of it is actually, foreign countries and bots and things that's not real, that's deliberately stoking rows. So I tweet something and they dump it in front of someone that they know wasn't meant for, or they sort of goad, or they deliberately attack me on Twitter, and that it's designed to create tensions. But of course, a lot of these social media mediums are binary in their very nature. They drive division and hate. They drive that sense of loneliness and isolation. I think governments have got to have a view on this. I think some of it needs regulation, by the way, and I say that in the book. But this is why, we can't just allow a free-for-all, in my view. You can't allow a technological free-for-all, and you have to promote empathy and this coming back together. And look, I'm in a particular political party. It has a vision of our past. It has a vision of our future. But it wasn't that long ago that David Cameron asked me to do a piece of work on the criminal justice system. And I was grateful to be asked, and I did the work. And he and Theresa May received my report and were very positive about it. Jeremy Corbyn was very positive about it. And Keir Starmer, who I put on my advisory group, you can see I was thinking ahead, was also very positive about it. The point is, I can't kind of imagine that now. I can't imagine Boris Johnson reaching across the aisle in that way. Things have become so partisan, so divided. We've moved so far to the extremes. And meanwhile, we've got this technology making it worse. So I think this business of the new tribalism and how we come back together is really, really important. And the thing that heartens me most about Black Lives Matter, as I say, is seeing white and black protesting, and seeing young white people for the first time with the kind of articulacy on race that I haven't seen before in this country. That gives me hope. Despite all the horrendous hate that's out there, it's really important to remember that, and I certainly see this, that the vast majority of people in our country abhor it. The vast majority of people do not share those feelings. They want to reach out. They want to be kind. They want to be generous. this does not really represent the best of us. And most people understand and know that.
Thanks, David. And thanks very much.
And really, I've got this horrible message on my computer that's worrying me. It says it's about to restart.
Oh, no.
God, which is really worrying. I'm afraid it's a parliamentary computer. It has a life of its own. And I can either press restart or snooze, which would be a real problem. So I'm going to press snooze.
Fingers crossed, everyone.
In the hope that snooze means it's going to go away. And it's gone away. So I should be okay.
Yes. Nice work. I can see William Jeremy has had his little blue hand up for some time. William, are you there? I've no idea what you'd like to say, but please do say it. William Jeremy, now is the moment. No, maybe he's had his hand up for so long that he's gone. Okay, never mind. We'll perhaps come back to William. Oh, you're there. Oh dear. Don't think we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Yes, I've just unmuted myself. Yes. Hi. It is fantastic to be here. I've just joined Tortoise, so it's brilliant. Just wanted to say to David, it is brilliant that you and Robert Buckland have got the justice brief between you, as it were, because I think that is a very positive development in terms of something going right with our current parliamentary arrangements. But what I also wanted to particularly say is I wanted to get your views about what we could do with the whole idea of Britishness being a multinational, multi-identity sort of portmanteau citizenship, which allows us all to be both Welsh and Scottish and Irish and African British and the whole, if you like, plethora and myriad nature of what it means to be human, whether we can put that into citizenship, which is both political, cultural, and personal at the same time. I know that's a very big question.
Well, the first thing is you allow me to be generous about Robert Buckland in a sort of cross-party way, because even though we have different political positions on a lot of things, he's a very distinguished lawyer. He has been assiduously polite. We've had numerous conversations on the phone, in the lobby. He's been kind, he's been generous, and it's really important to say all of those things because, you know, this is not a war in which I wish anything but good luck and to my counterpart, and I hope that he feels the same about me. But obviously when we get to the dispatch box, you know, it's serious and I've got a job to do, because we have different opinions about the resources that are available for, they say, for things like legal aid, and you know, how we should deal with some of the problems we've got in our justice system. In terms of your broader question about Britishness, I think at this time, I mean, obviously we could spend a very long time on this subject, but the thing I would want to say, and I talk about this in the book, is, again, we do need to know our history in this country. One of the things that came up during Brexit that was deeply unsettling, frankly, particularly for our Irish brothers and sisters, was the lack of understanding here in England about why we even had a border, what the story was, you know, all the way back to 1922, the famine, what the history is, because we don't really understand or learn that history in our schools, in our universities, in this country. we obviously Black Lives Matter raises real questions about the colonial period. We tend to know a lot about Henry VIII. We tend to know a lot about defeating Hitler, but there's a hell of a lot in between, and it's skipped over, other than to say we had the Industrial Revolution, but not really to talk about how that Industrial Revolution was fed and financed, frankly, by colonization and, for my descendants, enslavement. And we do have to understand this history if we are to share this space. And I don't say that so that we sort of hang our heads in shame at the bits of that history that are, you know, horrendous, problematic, depressing. It's because to stand tall in the world as a truly multi-ethnic nation that's standing up for human rights, and particularly, you know, look at what's happening in Hong Kong. You frankly have to have fessed up to your own history before you can do that successfully, or you're constantly playing smoke and mirrors and you're on the back foot. And by the way, if we're going to be striking trade deals with these big Commonwealth countries like India, we probably better understand how the Indians view the British period in that in the Indian subcontinent from their perspective, not just the history books that were written here. So I would do that as a starter for 10, as a better way for understanding this shared space. And clearly there are, I love going up to Scotland. I love the history of Scotland. I've got extended family that live in the Scottish Highlands. I love being in that part, and there's a different sensibility, in fact, when you're in Scotland, and include when you're in Wales. Understanding the real stories behind that, and why in those parts of the country there are perspectives, particularly on England, I think is really important.
Thanks, David, and thank you so much for your question, William. I'm going to come now actually to Tanya, my colleague Tanya, who private message said she was itching to ask ... Tan. Oh, of course you look amazing. I knew it. Hi, Tan.
How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, so I work for Tortoise, and I just couldn't not bring this up. You know, I'm sure you're aware of Keir Starmer's comments. Firstly, I'm sure many Black Labour voters agree with me that I'm now very sceptical about voting for your party. And I think, you know, you started off this thinking, talking about how the George Floyd case has allowed, I guess, the UK to reflect on its own structural problems. But really, has it? Because we've got people in these powerful positions. I use Keir Starmer, who's supposed to represent a party that you think, you know, would sympathise with these issues, and you've got now Matt Hancock, who can't even really say how many BAME people are working in office. Like, it's a bit. And if we're talking about change, we always talk about how it has to start in the top. It has to come from these leaders, but it seems that, you know, there's no real solution to this. And it's great to see people march. But one thing, a bit controversial to say, how long are we going to march? Like, our parents marched, then their parents marched. So it's kind of, I'm not really buying that this is a good thing, and that, you know, we're seeing people, you know, united, because we have seen this before, but yet we're stuck in the same problem. So
thank you, Tanya. And I really, can you see these bags under my eyes?
Yeah.
When you say you're tired, and you look beautiful, by the way, I don't look beautiful, but you know, I really understand that business of being tired, about that sort of weariness. How long do we have to wait? I really understand where that's coming from.
How comfortable do you feel being in a party where your leader?
I want to say this. I want to say this. The first thing is, this, when I say that this is a historic moment, and let me be clear, you know, Keir Starmer, who I work very closely with and I know very well, also meant that this is a historic moment. And having been in frontline politics for 20 years, I can tell you, we all do interviews and we all have questions. And I can't remember who this was. I think it might have been Piers Morgan. You know, sometimes things don't come out in quite the way you want to say them. But I know that he meant that this is a historic moment as well. I think it's because, let's break it down, Tanya. Black people have been pushed forward to talk about race for really many hundreds of years. We've made comedy about it, from Eddie Murphy to Dave Chappelle to Lenny Henry to Chris Rock. We've written books about it, from James Baldwin to Maya Angelou to Toni Morrison and many others. I'm not even going to go through the list of songs that we've made and continue to make about this subject.
Oh, David, all due respect, you're not really answering the question.
I am. I'm just giving you a long way of answering it because I want to answer it my way. But the point is, my central point, Tanya, is this is not about your weariness. This moment has to be about whiteness. It's got to be about your colleagues. That's what this moment is about. That's why I say there's some optimism. It's not actually about how you or I feel on this occasion. It's about what the majority population in Britain, what they are now going to do. And look, the truth is, if you're asking me to be depressed, I don't get to be depressed. My job is to give people hope. And on behalf of the constituents I represent, I get up every day to give them hope. So I'm not here to be all crestfallen. What I would say also about Keir Starmer is Keir Starmer represents Camden. You can just spend time in Somerstown with him and you know that he holds the Somali community, particularly in that constituency, close to his heart. Keir Starmer was a lawyer at Doughty Street. That is a preeminent chamber in lawyers supporting Black people in fighting for their rights, and Keir has been part of that journey. Keir Starmer gets this stuff. Please do not judge Keir Starmer on the basis of one interview where he didn't use the word historic in relation to moment, when that is, of course, what he meant. He has taken the knee. He understands this moment. And more importantly, he has challenged Boris Johnson to implement my review on the criminal justice system, because he was on the board of that review. So that's why I have this optimism.
Of what we do as people, constantly making excuses for our white counterparts. At the end of the day, maybe he has a good heart, but he's also on a platform. And if someone has worked so deeply on these issues and has been so woke about Black people in the community, then why would that come out of his mouth? This is not about our white colleagues, really. This is
what's the bit that you object to?
The fact that you've just said, like, oh well, you don't understand. You know, I know his heart, and it kind of takes the accountability away from him, because you may know him, but
he's not here. So all I can do is speak from. All I can do, Tanya, is speak my truth, and that's my truth.
Thanks, David.
That's all I can do.
Thank you, Tanya. I'm going to move on just because I'm looking at the time ticking. I think it's a really important conversation that you guys are having. I'm going to go to Maya because she's got her hand up, and then actually there was a comment a while ago in the chat from Safa about access to education and things, which is something that David's close to David's heart as well, and I'd quite like to get to that if we can. But let's go to Maya first. Are you there, Maya?
Hello. Yes.
Hello.
Hi guys.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
I was really
My
interested.
daughter's called Maya.
Oh, lovely. Great minds. Your mum, well, my mum and you and your wife, I suppose. I can't take credit. I was really interested in the conversation that Tanya and yourself were having, actually. I think, you know, I agree, we have been at this point, you know, the tipping point far too many times, and I feel as though we've rolled back, or perhaps not rolled back, but taken tiny steps forward, and either way, it's not enough. What we have right now is insufficient in terms of protecting communities of colour, minority communities. And so I turn to what solutions are there, what actionable solutions are there, you know, for people of the electorate to actually try and force change. And, you know, I am sort of cognizant of the Audre Lorde quote and all that, but I want to know what prospects you believe there are for utilising the courts to either spark, you know, review of the disproportionate impact of government policies on BME communities, or otherwise, essentially, do you think the courts are a viable option to try and at least pressure change? And what do you think the reception would be by the country as a whole to that kind of action?
Well, look, the courts are important often on behalf of individuals who've experienced racism and discrimination. And sometimes the courts, particularly in relation to judicial review, can be important collectively, particularly where an equality duty has not been, you know, pushed forward by a government department. So, for example, clearly the Home Office, in relation to its treatment of people from the Windrush generation, has got a lot to answer for. And even yesterday, despite all that's been said to make amends, we find out that the standard that they're being asked to meet is beyond reasonable doubt, which is the highest bar that could possibly be set to establish that you're entitled to compensation in our country. So yes, there is a role for the courts. But what I said a few weeks ago is, and I sense your weariness, and I sense Tana's weariness before me as well, is this is part of the problem, is that Britain is not really a revolutionary country, it's an evolutionary country. It relies on good faith. And the problem here is it feels like there's quite a lot of bad faith. That if I do a review and I make 35 recommendations, implement the review. If Angiolini does a review on deaths in police custody and she makes over 30 odd recommendations, implement the review. If Baroness Ruby McGregor does a review on the problems of Black people in the workplace, and you don't implement the fact that she called for an ethnicity pay gap, implement the review. Don't kick things into the long grass. People are worried about that with the Grenfell inquiry. And where Wendy Williams has given such a fantastic lessons learned review on Windrush, why do you need to set up a working group to once again consider just get on with it? And so that's the frustration. I know the frustration. I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. The action is there. Just do it. Get on with it. Make it happen. And it's that lens that I think we've got to really hold Boris and Dominic Cummings and Jacob Rees-Mogg and those around him to account. And to, you know, and to say that this particular tinge that we're seeing, in my view, of the Conservative Party seems particularly against doing anything in relation to this. And of course, if you then kick off and set up another commission and you ask, and people are on that commission that don't even seem to care about racial justice, indeed, they've dismissed it in the past, then of course the trust goes. But the problem is, if people lose their trust in people like me, well, then what happens? They take to the streets. And they burn things and they loot things and they kick off, because that's the only way they feel that they can be heard. So if you believe in the democratic process, what I'm saying and what people are asking for in relation to racial justice in this country is really, really deeply important. And it saddens me greatly that there's so much disillusionment, I think, amongst Black and minority ethnic populations in relation to this. And obviously, I think the previous question indicated that, and I understand where it's coming from. But I can't be disillusioned. I can't give up hope. I jump out of bed every day up for the fight, because that's the kind of guy I am, and that's what people need me to be, and what I'm determined to be.
Thanks, David. Great question, Maya. I'm going to go now to Meronisa and then perhaps Matthew Dancona, who we have to thank for having David with us here this evening at all. Are you there, Meronisa? Hello.
Yes, I am. Hi, how's everybody doing today?
Hi, Arizona State.
Hi, David. This has been really, really interesting to listen to. I actually had a question arising from a comment that you made earlier when you talked a little bit about this is not the moment for people of colour. As I understood it, you were talking about how it's about white realization, right? Like the question around privilege and whiteness.
That's me being challenging and saying, listen, when people say to me, does racism exist in Britain? What's white privilege? I'm like, look, please, you guys have the conversation. I've been doing this for years. I mean, what more can I say? That's the point. Yeah.
Yeah. So so that was really interesting to me, because I was listening to a podcast a couple of days ago from the New Yorker. And there was I don't know who this person is, I can look it up, but she was talking about how little resource has been spent on talking to white people about the issues of racism. And it was interesting to me, because as people of color, we keep doing this work all the time, right? It's almost like in our DNA. And so I would like to hear more about why you think we've arrived at that point, because sometimes I feel like maybe I'm not seeing that. But if you as a politician are seeing something that we're not seeing, I think it's really important that we know what that is, and we find a way to get into that conversation and move it forward.
Wonderful question. Now, I think the individual you're talking about is the author of a book called White Fragility. And I would encourage people to rush out and buy Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. Which I think really explores this subject, and I think is an excellent book. I'm not a soothsayer, so maybe I understand that those who were around, like I was, after the murder of Stephen Lawrence and the Macpherson inquiry, thought that there was a historic moment. Those who saw me rattle the cage after Windrush and saw the apology and then heard a review thought that there was a moment. So I understand that business if we've been here before. But I guess that the truth is, because of coronavirus, all of us are at home like we are. We're all on Zoom. We're all on social media. There's been a sort of pause and a looking, because we're doing our job slightly differently. And I guess we also look at what's happening in the state with Donald Trump, particularly, and that has reached people in a slightly different way. That's as far as I want to go. What people then do with that opportunity, I can't say. I hope they will use that opportunity, and I'm doing all I can to encourage that and make that happen. Now, clearly here politically, it's not easy, because I think that there are definitely folk within government who don't buy any of this stuff and don't believe in any of this stuff. That is true. I don't think that's true of the whole of the of the Conservative Party, but I worry about that obviously within parts of government. And I'm conscious here that I'm here in London, and there will be people in parts of the country who maybe see this or feel this in a slightly different way. But I want to believe that it's an opportunity, and I think that breaking down that, if you like, that majority culture and what that means is, it does mean that racism is not just an individual act. It's not just someone being nasty to me. Racism is not just someone who puts on a white hood or is part of the EDL. Those things are obvious. Racism in the end is structural. It's a system that started several hundred years ago. It started with scientific racism, lots of bogus science, in fact, but people that were very distinguished at the time, who created a pecking order, who said that people like me were closer to the apes, which allowed white Europeans to colonize much of the world and create that pecking order. and enslaved my ancestors. And I don't know what my original name was in terms of my ancestral name. I have to take a DNA test to find out where they were, just about in the continent of Africa. And when my descendants were finally freed, they were freed with no money. The money went to our slavers. So I come from a very impoverished, poor community that spent hundreds of years trying to find its feet, and is still struggling with that. And that is common in the Caribbean and people who come here, and it's common with our African American brothers and sisters as well. And of course, there are really important stories across the Indian subcontinent, across Africa, of tragic incidences of subjugation and oppression. And it's important to understand those stories and hear those stories and hear why people feel how they feel, and begin to tell that story, not just from the point of view of those who won, but those who fought back, and the complexities and the nuances of that story in order to progress and to move on and to hold your head up high. So, and to understand how these things live on and why people feel insecure, why, when I go into a shop in London and I'm wearing a hoodie and I'm with my son, and the security guards follows us around the store. I've been stopped and searched. The first time I was stopped and searched, I was 12. I was so scared I wet myself. That's not the classic image of a black urban kid, but that's what happened. I was stopped and searched with my brother, who was a magistrate, in a car. Police had guns. We had to get out the car. That wasn't that long ago. I was an MP at the time, and it was only when they realized they were an MP, they apologized and went on their way. So, it's getting underneath what that's really about. And I hope that people are up for hearing that. And let me just say something else as a Labour politician, particularly when people use the phrase white privilege, I think it is important to understand that there are a lot of people in this country who don't feel very privileged at all. We've had 10 years of austerity. Class and deprivation is real in Britain. So when people use that phrase, I think they're also saying that they can understand that you may not be feeling very privileged. Life may be pretty hard for you wherever you are in the country, particularly if you're working class. But it's to say that race is not one of the things that makes it harder. It's to say that remember that there are folk who may have the same economics as you, but actually their race then makes it harder. And it's why we're seeing in this coronavirus that even when you looked at the first 20 doctors that died in this country, they were black and brown. I mean, hard to describe doctors as deprived, but they're black and brown ones were the ones that were dying. And if you look at those on the front line, care workers, bus drivers, nurses, look at their faces and look at their colours and see who is dying, look at the statistics. These are issues that are in part, not totally, but in part, about structural discrimination and inequalities that still exist in our society.
Thanks so much, David. We're into the last 5 minutes, so I'm going to go to Matt.
Really, I can go on for another hour.
I know, well, you all could. I'm going to go to Matt because I promised him I would, and it's thanks to Matt that David's joined us this evening. Are you there, Matthew?
Hi, Matt.
Hello.
Hi, David. Thanks so much.
Look at that bookcase. Oh my God.
Just wallpaper. I was actually going to. I'm really glad you mentioned the Robin DiAngelo book, because that was something that had a big impact on me. But as a kind of follow up to that, David, you said you're not a prophet, but actually, something we've talked about in the past, and you wrote a very good book about, was the 2011 riots.
Oh yeah.
And you warned in that there were the seeds in those conflicts, which were not just a law and order phenomenon of future tensions. And I'm sort of scrolling forward to now. I mean, one of the things I think that's happened is that some of the crash barriers in mainstream politics that used to exist about what was permissible in the mainstream have been knocked down. So, we now have a prime minister who referred to Muslim women as bank robbers and resembling letterboxes. And admittedly, Farage is no longer in the centre, but the Brexit campaign that he led used very inflammatory language like breaking point and so on. And suddenly you get mainstream figures using language that's very worrying. And I just wonder, as we head into a period where it looks like, unfortunately, there's going to be quite a deep recession, and we know historically that kind of economic context is a happy hunting ground for bigots. How concerned are you about the far right and the mainstreaming of the far right, partly through technology?
Well,
Sorry.
look, so the hope for me is the millennials, Generation Y, who I think get it. They get climate change. They get the bogus lie that our problems are down to Iqbal, who moved in down the road, or Vlad, who moved over from Poland. They get all that. They don't believe it. They want these global solutions. So my hope is with the millennials and Generation Y. However, as you rightly indicate, Matthew, there's some way from the levers of power. In between them are our generation, Gen Xers, and then above us, still running stuff, are the baby boomers, right? We've got 2 baby boomers who want to lead the United States, and the United States will decide in November. And we've got a recession, depression on top of this, of a period of austerity that we've had in our own country, and a global economic downturn that began in 2008. So, of course, there's lots to be worried about and fearful of, because the major challenges in the in tray of leaders in our countries, as you know, Matthew, are automation, the heating up of the planet, a population that's living longer, and how you deal with pensions, and how you deal with work profiles. Those are the really the artificial intelligence. Those are the major challenges. But it's easy for the populists to come along and say, "Oh, we're not going to deal with any of that. That's all bogus. The real challenge is immigration. The real challenge is the European Union. The real challenge is we need to build a Mexican wall." And we know that politicians in a previous age have used those tricks. It leads to division. It leads to conflict. And we have to overcome it. And those of us who are more progressive in bent, who really want to hold on to this idea of one nation, have to really work hard to redouble our efforts, to tell a national story, to understand that need for belonging, to regulate where we need to on some of the issues around technology, and to be in the business of nation building in a constant way. And yes, you would expect someone like me to be right at the forefront of those battles still to be had on identity politics and things like Black Lives Matter. But in the end, the demand that we have to come back together again, and we need a common purpose. So it's a big project. Of course, I'm worried. I'm worried in part because I think the British people rejected my party at the last election, and clearly a lot of the British people rejected it because they believed that there were extreme elements within the Labour Party. However you feel about that, it's clear that they took a view about Jeremy Corbyn, and it was rejected. But they perhaps didn't quite look as hard as they should have done about what they were choosing, because I'm afraid there are some extreme elements within this current government. This is a government that sort of grabbed sort of UKIP Brexit Party and brought it in. And we're now wrestling with that in the shape of Dominic Cummings and Munir and others who are advising Boris Johnson. So this is going to be a challenging period. And it's incumbent on those that share my views and some of the others that have been expressed to speak up. And if you are an ally is a verb. It means doing, not just mouthing off gently. It means being active. And this, my God, is a period in which to be active and to make your voice heard.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, David, and thank you so much to everybody. There was so much stuff that we didn't get to. I really wanted to bring in Safa's experience of access to university and what have you. Luke had some brilliant comments, Sameen in the chat. There was loads of things, education reform, tons of stuff that we didn't get to. So maybe we'll have a Mark II version in the future. But I just want to say a huge thank you to David. You bring so much energy. Even in my little Zoom screen, I can sort of feel the optimism and the energy, and I don't know where you get it from, but
stay optimistic, guys. Arnie, I hope I've persuaded you. I really do. It matters to me so much.
Oh, I can tell it matters to you, and we'll look after Tanya, David. Thank you so much to everybody. As always, have a lovely rest of the evening. I'm so sorry to the Tottenham fans who had half an hour on the football and half an hour on this. Go drown your sorrows, or
yeah, I want to know how Tottenham's doing. I'm totally out the loop now. I've got to go.
Do go. Have a nice rest of the evening. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
We normally do a chat, but we can only do a wave. Have a nice rest of the evening. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.